On his birthday, as candles flickered in the dining room, his daughter leaned close enough for him to hear and whispered, "We thought you'd be gone by now." The laughter of the others drowned the weight of her words, but they struck deeper than any blow. He sat still, his hands folded, his eyes lowered, and in that instant, the celebration around him turned into a theater of betrayal. Plates clattered, toasts were made, yet he heard none of it, only that cruel sentence echoing in his chest, as if he had already been buried while still breathing. He remembered when this same table had been a place of warmth, where his children once fought for a seat beside him, eager for his stories, his advice, his smile. Now he sat invisible, treated as a relic whose presence was endured rather than honored. He did not rage, did not raise his voice. He let silence become his shield, though the silence was heavier than stone. They saw his age, his slowing steps, his thinning voice, and in their careless cruelty they mistook it for weakness. They mistook him for a man already fading from life. He glanced at the faces around him, faces he had carried through hardship, educated with sleepless labor, provided for with calloused hands. They had been his pride, his reason to rise each morning when the world pressed against him. Now those same faces looked past him, over him, as if waiting for his absence to make their future more convenient. They smiled at each other, spoke of plans, ignored the man who had built the very roof under which they sat. It was not the first time he had been diminished. For months, perhaps years, he had felt the weight of being erased. Small slights that grew into deeper cuts, conversations where his voice was silenced, gatherings where his chair was pushed to the side, decisions made as though his life no longer held value. But this time was different. This time the words were spoken aloud, unmasked, cruel, and direct. "We thought you'd be gone by now." He closed his eyes, breathing steady. Rage would have been easy. Fury would have been natural. But he knew neither would heal what had been broken. Instead, he sat taller, hiding the storm inside. His silence unsettled them more than anger could. They thought him powerless, but they had forgotten. A man who has lived a full life carries more than years. He carries truths, and those truths can rewrite the fate of any family. And so he waited. For the right moment. For the page not yet turned. For the one final document that would speak louder than their cruelty. Louder than time itself. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever faced something like this in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us grow this channel and bring you more powerful stories every day. And now, we continue. They looked at him and saw only the weight of years, the slow shuffle of his steps, the tremor in his hands when he lifted a glass. To them, he was fading, a shadow in the corner of his own home, a presence tolerated rather than cherished. They measured his life not by the miles he had walked or the burdens he had carried, but by how little time they assumed he had left. His frail frame was all they noticed, as if bones could speak louder than memory, as if wrinkles erased history. But inside, he was not what they saw. Within his silence lived the man who had once risen before dawn to lay brick upon brick, who had held tools with strength they could not imagine, who had faced storms that threatened to break him and had come out unbroken. They forgot the battles he had fought, both on foreign soil and at home, when hunger pressed against the door, when illness nearly stole what little they had. He remembered every night he went without, so they could have enough. He remembered every promise he kept, though no one thanked him. At the table they laughed easily, as if he were no longer part of their story. They saw weakness where there had once been fire. Yet he knew that even as his body slowed, his will remained stronger than theirs. They could not see the man who built the walls around them, who had signed the loans they never knew existed, who had carried their futures on his back without complaint. To them, he was a burden, waiting to be lifted. To him, he was still the pillar, though the house he supported had forgotten his strength. Every slight cut deeper because he loved them. It would have been easier if he were a stranger, But these were his own, blood of his blood, the very people for whom he had endured sleepless years and endless toil. Now they dismissed him as though his story had ended, as though he were nothing more than time counting down in a failing body. And yet, behind his quiet eyes burned a truth that no one could erase. He was not fading, he was waiting, waiting for the moment when they would see him not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as the man who had always been the foundation of their lives. The laughter at the table rose and fell like waves crashing against a shore, but none of it touched him. He sat among them, yet apart from them, the chair beneath him more present than his voice. Plates were passed from hand to hand, skipping over him as though his reach no longer mattered. Stories were shared, full of excitement and plans, but not once did anyone turn their eyes toward him. Not once did they ask for his thoughts. It was as though he were a shadow, occupying space but not life, a ghost seated in a home that had been built by his sacrifices. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the very structure that surrounded them. Every corner held his labor, his sweat, his years of quiet endurance. He remembered when the beams had been nothing more than wood and nails beneath his blistered hands, when the roof overhead had been raised with his strength and his coin. It was his house, his gift to them, though they spoke and acted as if he were a guest overstaying his welcome. The betrayal was not in the words they said, but in the silence that swallowed him whole, in the way their eyes slid past him as though he had already been erased. It is a strange kind of cruelty to be forgotten while still alive, to walk in rooms filled with your own history and feel no recognition, no acknowledgement of the years poured into every stone. He had built this home so that his children and grandchildren would have a place to gather, a place to feel safe. Yet now it was they who gathered, and he who sat at the edge of their joy, unwanted, unnoticed. They called it family, but to him it felt like exile within his own walls. Every clatter of a fork, every burst of laughter cut deeper, not because he envied their happiness, but because he was excluded from it. He had become invisible, and invisibility is its own form of death. Yet he bore it with silence, because his dignity was greater than their neglect. He knew what they did not, that one day, perhaps sooner than they thought, his silence would no longer be mistaken for weakness. The very house that ignored him would be forced to remember whose hands had raised it, whose name was etched unseen into its foundation. He sat still while their voices carried over him, words falling carelessly like ashes from a fire they did not know he could feel. They spoke not of him as a father or grandfather, not of his life still present at the table, but of what would remain once he was gone. Inheritances, debts, the division of property, they plotted the future as though his body were already lowered into the ground. It was not rage in their voices, nor even malice. It was something colder, crueler, casual disregard. Betrayal rarely announces itself in shouts. It comes quietly, hidden in planning too free, in numbers spoken aloud while the man they erased still breathes. They spoke of the house, its value, who might claim it. They spoke of accounts, of belongings, of what could be sold to settle their desires. Each word carried the weight of dismissal, as if his worth existed only in what he could leave behind, not in what he had already given. His presence meant nothing to them now. He was a ledger line, a calculation, a shadow of currency that would one day be theirs. They looked past him, exchanged glances, each imagining themselves richer once his chair was empty. He listened without interruption, the sting of their words sharper than any wound he had carried in youth. He had fought to build, not to be counted as spoils. He had sacrificed so they might never know hunger, never know fear, never know the cruel weight of survival pressing them into the dirt. Yet here they were, his own blood, weighing his life like merchants weighing grain. His heart did not rage, it ached. There is a sorrow deeper than anger, the sorrow of realizing those you love see you as a burden to outlast. The room around him blurred, not from weakness of age, but from the heaviness of knowing. They believed he was powerless, fading, too frail to matter. They did not realize that in his silence he still carried something greater than their schemes. The right to choose what his final act would mean. They mistook his stillness for surrender, his quiet for defeat. But he had not surrendered. He was watching, listening, storing every word, letting the truth of their hearts reveal itself. And one day soon, when the paper was placed before him, when the pen touched the page, he would decide, not them, how the story of his life and legacy would be written. The more they spoke, the deeper he fell into memory. Their careless words, spoken as if his life were a clock nearly wound down, rose against the vastness of what he had lived through. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was not the frail figure at the table, but the man he had once been, shoulders broad beneath the weight of labor, hands hardened by years of work. He remembered the nights when lamps burned late and his tools struck against stone long after others had gone to rest. Every hour stolen from sleep, given freely so his children could eat, study, and dream without fear. He saw himself as a young man, standing in the biting wind of wars they had never known, when the sound of survival was not laughter around a table, but the crack of gunfire in distant fields. He had endured hunger, exhaustion, loss, all so they would never have to. His body bore scars they had never asked about, because to them he was only the old man, and not the soldier who had once carried the weight of a nation on his back. Their mockery and dismissal, their cruel arithmetic of years left, clashed against decades of sacrifice that no one at that table could measure. He thought of the house itself, each stone and beam heavy with the sweat of his labor. He had poured himself into its foundation, not simply building walls but carving a place for memory, a refuge for family. He had built not for himself but for them, so they might never know the cold emptiness he once knew. Yet here they sat within those very walls, laughing as though his name had no meaning, speaking as though his life had no weight. But his worth was not in the wrinkles on his face, nor in the fragile frame they dismissed so easily. His worth was written across a lifetime of endurance, sacrifice, and unspoken victories. He had given without demand, served without complaint, endured without recognition. And though they failed to see it, his legacy was not fading. It was already immortal, pressed into every life they lived so easily, paid for by his hands. Sitting in silence, he felt no need to defend himself with words. Time itself was his witness. Every moment of his past was greater than the shallow judgment of the present. They measured him in years left. He measured himself in years lived. And the balance would never be theirs to change. The morning was gray when he rose, his steps slower than they once had been, but steady with purpose. No one asked where he was going. They rarely asked anything anymore. He walked alone through the streets, the air sharp against his face, carrying with him not bitterness, but the quiet weight of decision. By the time he reached the lawyer's office, his silence had hardened into something unshakable. He did not come for revenge. Revenge was small, fleeting, beneath the dignity of a man who had endured so much. He came for truth, for order, for the quiet justice that outlives cruelty. The lawyer rose as he entered, surprised perhaps to see him without family at his side. He placed his hat on the chair, folded his hands, and spoke simply, his voice soft but firm. Not a word of anger left his lips. He spoke of dignity, of fairness, of setting things right while his heart still beat strong enough to decide. He would not wait for others to write the end of his story. He would write it himself, with pen, with paper, with the authority that belonged to him alone. The lawyer listened carefully, his eyes shifting between the frail figure before him and the steady conviction in his words. Papers were drawn, and on the desk lay a document that seemed to glow with unspoken weight. It was not merely a will, not merely a plan for what would follow his departure. It was a voice carried forward, a declaration that he was not yet gone, nor erased, nor powerless. It would speak while he still lived, forcing recognition from those who had chosen to forget. He read each line slowly, the words anchoring his resolve. This was not born of bitterness, but of love twisted too long into disregard. He did not wish to punish. He wished to remind. He wished to carve into law what had always been carved into his life, that respect is not inherited, that dignity is not optional, that truth will not be silenced, even by neglect. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he touched it, not yet signing, not yet sealing, but knowing that when the time came, this document would thunder louder than his frail voice ever could. He left the office as quietly as he had entered, his coat pulled close against the wind. The folder pressed against his chest was not just paper, it was his final gift, his final defense, his final truth. He walked back into the world, not as a man waiting to fade, but as a man carrying the power of his life's work in silence, ready for the day when that silence would break and remind them all who he truly was. For weeks the folder lay hidden, resting quietly in the drawer beside his bed, its edges worn from the touch of his fingers, though the final page remained unsigned. Each night he would sit alone, the lamp casting its thin glow, and he would draw the folder closer, opening it slowly as though it were a living thing. His eyes would move over the words, each line carrying the weight of his entire life, each clause a reminder that he was not powerless, not voiceless, not erased. And yet he would close it again, slide it back into the shadows, choosing silence a little longer. It was not fear that kept his pen still. It was patience. During those weeks his family grew careless, bolder in their neglect, blind to the quiet power that trembled in his hands each time he touched that folder. At the table they no longer whispered. They spoke openly of what would be theirs, of how things would be divided, as though the air in his lungs did not matter. They passed him by without notice, their voices loud with plans that treated him as a memory already gone. Each word deepened the wound, yet also strengthened his resolve. He listened without speaking, knowing that every cruelty, every thoughtless glance, would make the moment of truth shine brighter when it came. Some evenings he would hold the pen, letting its weight rest between his fingers, imagining the stroke of ink that would change everything. His hand trembled, but not from weakness, only from the knowledge of what it meant. A single signature, simple and unassuming, would outlive their mockery and bind his voice into history. He was not signing for revenge, not to punish, but to remind them that he had always been more than they saw. A builder, a provider, a man who carried his family until they forgot the weight of being carried. He would close the folder, return it to its place, and lie awake long into the night, the silence around him filled with memory. They thought he was fading, but in truth he was waiting, steady as stone, allowing their arrogance to ripen, their pride to blind them further. For when the day came, when his pen finally touched the paper, the truth would fall upon them like a storm they had never expected. Until then, he remained still, the hidden pen a secret power cradled in his hands, invisible yet undeniable, a promise waiting in silence. It came one evening, heavier than the others, when the air in the room was thick with laughter and clinking glasses. He sat in his chair, his hands folded neatly before him, his eyes lowered, as though studying the table. And then it happened. Not whispered this time, not hidden behind glances and careful tones, but spoken aloud, cutting the air in two. His own son leaned forward, voice firm, certain, careless in its cruelty. He won't be with us much longer. We need to plan. The words were a hammer blow, not only for their meaning, but for their audacity. Declared openly, as though he were deaf, as though the breath still moving in his chest was irrelevant, as though the father who had given his son everything had already been lowered into the earth. For a moment the room fell into uneasy quiet, but not for long. The others nodded, some shifting in their chairs, others looking away as though embarrassed, but no one corrected him. No one said, "He is here. He is alive. He is still our blood." Silence became consent, and he understood in that instant just how far he had been erased from the story he had written with his life. The food before him grew cold. His son's voice carried on, now speaking of the house, the land, the accounts, of what should be divided, what should be sold, how debts could be balanced once the old man was gone. Each word was a shovel of dirt, as if burying him before his time, and each nod of agreement was another layer of earth pressing down on his chest. He sat still, unmoving, though inside his heart thundered with a storm greater than any he had weathered in youth. He was not weak, not deaf, not gone, and yet his own son, his flesh and blood, treated him as though he were less than the chair upon which he sat. But he did not break. His silence was not surrender, but a shield heavier than any outburst could have been. He sat straighter, his eyes narrowing, though he said nothing. Let them believe he was powerless. Let them think their words had sealed his fate. He alone knew the truth. The folder still rested in his drawer. The pen still waited for his hand. He carried within him the strength of patience, and patience is the weapon of the wounded who have endured too much. That evening, as laughter resumed and plans were made over his fading presence, he remained unmoving, carved into stone. They saw a frail figure shrinking into silence, but he knew, when the time came, his silence would roar louder than all their voices. The breaking point was not his, it was theirs, and they did not even see it coming. He did not answer. He did not strike the table, though his son's words still burned like iron against his chest. Instead, he drew in a breath, slow and steady, and sat taller, his back straight, his shoulders square. His silence was heavier than any thunder, deeper than the cruelty that had been spoken over him. To rage would have been easy, to strike the table, to throw back the years of sacrifice into their ungrateful faces. But he knew rage would only feed their mockery. What they could not endure, what they could not ignore, was silence laced with dignity. The room filled again with chatter, voices rising as though nothing had been said, but his stillness began to press against them. He did not look down in shame, nor turn away in defeat. His eyes lingered on each of them, calm, unflinching, until they felt his gaze, even without meeting it. He was no longer the man erased at the table. He was something larger, a presence they could not deny, though they tried to fill the air with laughter to drown the truth. Patience was his weapon. It had been all his life. Patience that built walls one stone at a time when money was scarce. Patience that endured years of back-breaking work so his children could sit in warm classrooms. Patience that fought wars not only with rifles but with hunger, with frost, with despair. He had been forged in silence, in waiting, in enduring storms until they passed, and now, once more, patience rose within him like a shield. He needed no fury. Justice would come, and it would come not by vengeance, but by truth. Truth that could not be denied. Truth that waited for the right moment to be revealed. They thought his silence meant surrender. They thought his lack of words was weakness. Yet silence has a weight words cannot carry. His silence filled the room like smoke, unseen but choking, pressing against their comfort, lingering in the back of their minds. Some looked down, fidgeted, tried to speak louder, but nothing could erase the quiet dignity of the man who refused to be reduced to their cruelty. He sat taller that night than he had in years, not in strength of body, but in strength of spirit. Every insult they thought they had buried him beneath became the ground upon which he stood. He would not meet their cruelty with equal fire. He would meet it with something far more enduring: justice without shouting, dignity without revenge, a silence so deep that when the moment came, it would roar louder than any fury they had ever known. Days later, when the family gathered again, children, grandchildren, in-laws, filling the house with noise and careless laughter, he entered the room carrying the folder. His steps were measured, his face unreadable, the same stillness he had worn for years masking the storm within. No one noticed at first. To them, it was just the old man again, holding papers no one cared to read, some bundle of forgotten bills or memories that belonged to another time. They glanced, then turned away, too absorbed in their own conversations, their own plans, their own illusion that he was already fading. He sat down slowly at the same place they always left for him, the corner of the table where he could watch but never lead, where his presence was tolerated rather than honored. The folder rested in his lap, its edges worn, its weight more than paper, more than ink. It carried years of silence, decades of sacrifice, a lifetime of truths unspoken. His fingers traced the cover, and in that small gesture was more strength than any word he could have spoken aloud. As the meal began, their voices rose, layered with talk of business, of inheritances, of debts and ambitions. He listened, his silence as steady as stone, and let them continue to imagine themselves heirs of a legacy they believed was already theirs. They did not notice the lawyer's presence at the far end of the room, waiting with quiet respect, as invisible to them as he himself had been all these years. It was almost poetic, he thought, how blindness repeats itself until it is shattered by truth. The children laughed. The grandchildren quarreled. The in-laws exchanged smirks over their glasses. And he sat, the folder resting on the table now, unopened, untouched, like a storm cloud waiting on the horizon. No one asked. No one cared. They thought his silence was habit, his paper nothing more than scraps. Yet behind that silence was the voice of his entire life, pressed into law, sealed in patience, waiting for the moment when they would be forced to listen. He looked around the table, his eyes lingering on each face, some proud, some indifferent, some already greedy in their expectation. He saw not just their present selves, but the children they once were, the nights he had carried them on his shoulders, the mornings he had risen early to feed them, the sacrifices they had long since forgotten. His heart ached with both love and sorrow, but he did not falter. The witnesses were gathered. The time was near. Soon they would understand that the old man with trembling hands held in his grasp something greater than all their plans combined. He placed the folder on the table with deliberate care, the faint sound of its weight against the wood louder than the laughter that had filled the room just moments before. Hands stilled in midair, forks paused above plates, and conversations faltered into silence. For the first time in years, every eye turned toward him, not with respect, not yet, but with confusion, as though wondering why the old man would interrupt their comfort. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence, steady and unbroken, drew their attention more powerfully than any demand could have. From the doorway, the lawyer stepped inside, his presence unexpected, his face composed with professional solemnity. Murmurs rippled through the room, chairs shifting, questions whispered, but no one dared to voice them aloud. Confusion turned into unease, unease into dread. The seal on the folder cracked open, its sound sharp in the heavy quiet, like a gavel striking wood. The weight of his silence began to unfold, line by line, written not in anger, but in truth. The lawyer's voice carried steadily, calm but unwavering, as he began to read. What spilled into the room was not accusation, not bitterness, but fact. Names, properties, accounts, decisions signed and witnessed, each word weaving a portrait of the man they thought powerless. He had not been fading, he had been preparing. His life, his work, His legacy had not been surrendered to their careless expectations. It had been preserved, shaped, and guarded by his own hand. They shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward one another, breaths quickening. The grandson who had smirked fell quiet. The daughter-in-law who had spoken so freely pressed her lips tight. His son, the one who had declared his life nearly over, paled beneath the weight of the words being read aloud. Every clause, every decision, struck deeper than any shout of fury ever could, because it was undeniable. It was written, witnessed, sealed. And still he did not gloat. He sat taller, his face calm, his hands folded before him as though in prayer. He let the truth do what his voice no longer needed to, restore his place, his worth, his dignity. The lawyer's words filled the room like a tide, and the arrogance that had filled their hearts began to sink beneath it. For the first time in a long time, they remembered that the man they dismissed had built the very foundation they sat upon. And now, through ink and law, through patience and silence, he was reminding them again. The lawyer's voice filled the room, steady and unhurried, each word a chisel cutting away the arrogance that had built up around them. He read, not with fire, not with scorn, but with a quiet authority that needed no embellishment. There was no anger in the lines, no bitterness laced into the sentences. It was simply truth, truth preserved in ink, truth carried forward on paper that bore his signature. His properties, his savings, his investments, even the land beneath their feet, none of it was left to those who had mocked him, ignored him, treated him as though he were already gone. Instead, it was entrusted to causes that mattered, to schools where children with nothing would find opportunity, to charities where the hungry would be fed, to shelters where the forgotten would be remembered, and to a select few, neighbors, friends, distant kin, who had never once forgotten his worth, who had treated him with dignity when his own blood had not. The air grew heavier with every sentence. The grandchildren lowered their eyes, their giggles silenced. The daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably, her smirk gone, replaced by a flush of shame that spread across her face. His son sat frozen, the words pressing into him like stones, each line another reminder that the man he dismissed as frail had written his final judgment long before this moment. It was not spoken in wrath, but carved into law with the clarity of justice. The old man sat still, his eyes steady, his silence louder than any outburst could have been. He did not smile. He did not gloat. This was not triumph for him. It was vindication. A lifetime of sacrifice had not been erased. They could pretend he was invisible at their table, but the world beyond these walls would carry his name. His legacy would live not in their shallow conversations, not in their greed, but in every scholarship given, in every roof raised, in every life touched by what he had chosen to give. The lawyer's voice trembled slightly now, not from weakness, but from respect, as he read the final passages. His name, repeated again and again, linked not to wealth for the ungrateful, but to hope for the deserving. It was undeniable, unerasable. They could not escape it. They could not talk over it. They could not laugh it away. For the first time, they were forced to sit in silence, hearing the measure of the man they had dismissed, and realizing that the legacy they believed was theirs had already been carried beyond their reach. Faces drained of color as the last words fell into the silence. The son, once so confident in his arrogance, felt his throat tighten until his voice cracked when he tried to speak. Nothing coherent left his lips, only fragments, broken syllables that betrayed the collapse of his pride. The daughter-in-law, who had so often smirked behind her glass, shrank into her chair, her lips trembling, her mask of superiority shattered into something fragile and small. The grandchildren, once giggling and careless, now stared at their plates, unable to meet the old man's eyes, their cheeks hot with shame. The weight of truth had done what years of silence never could. It stripped them bare, showing them not as heirs, but as children who had forgotten the cost of their comfort. And there he sat, the man they had dismissed as nearly gone, frail, irrelevant. Yet now he spoke louder than ever, without opening his mouth. His voice was not in sound, but in the authority of a life carved into law, a lifetime pressed into paper no greed could alter. His silence thundered over them, and they felt smaller beneath it than they had ever imagined. The son's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table, his eyes darting toward the folder as though it might suddenly change, as though he might undo what was already sealed. The daughter-in-law blinked back tears she would not let fall, remembering every careless word she had spoken, every glance of disdain she had cast toward the man she now realized was larger than she had ever seen him. Even the grandchildren, who had repeated the mockery they had overheard, now understood. This was not a man fading into nothingness. This was a man whose legacy would outlive all of them, whose choices had the power to shape futures far beyond their reach. Their shame was not just in what they lost, it was in what they had never given. Respect, gratitude, recognition. They had starved him of these while taking freely of everything else he provided, and now the absence of their thanks weighed on them heavier than the absence of inheritance. The man they had erased had written himself into permanence, and they could no longer look at him as they once did. He was not the shadow at the table. He was the light that revealed their own darkness. He did not gloat. He did not scold. He did not throw their shame back at them, though it hung heavy in the air like smoke after a fire. Instead, he reached slowly for the pen that lay beside the folder. His hand, though marked by age and years of labor, was steady as he lifted it. The room held its breath, every eye fixed on the man they had once called frail, powerless, forgotten. He placed the tip against the page, and in the silence, the sound of ink scratching across paper was louder than any outcry. One signature, simple and deliberate, was more than a legal act. It was a declaration carved into the moment itself. I am still here. I am not erased. My worth is undeniable. His face did not harden with anger, nor soften with triumph. It remained calm, dignified, like a man who had already won the battle, without ever raising his voice. The lawyer nodded, recognizing the weight of that final stroke, while the family sat frozen, their pride and greed dissolved in the stillness. There was no need for fury. Vengeance would have been small, beneath him. What he gave instead was greater, dignity, the kind that stands taller than cruelty, the kind that cannot be touched by scorn. The son tried to speak, his words stammering, but the old man did not answer. The daughter-in-law lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes, and the grandchildren shifted uneasily, knowing they would remember this silence longer than any lecture. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to remind them of all he had endured. The truth was already alive in the air around them, written into permanence by his own hand. When he set the pen down, it was as though a gavel had struck, ending not just a reading of words, but an era of disregard. His silence spoke volumes, heavier than years of dismissal, deeper than their casual betrayals. They saw not a frail man signing away property, but a father, a patriarch, a life that could never be diminished, no matter how they had tried. And though he said nothing, they understood. They had measured him wrongly, and they would never have the power to do so again. Years passed, and the dust of that night never truly settled. They spoke of it in hushed tones, sometimes with pride, sometimes with shame, but always with the weight of memory. What endured was not the image of a bitter old man seeking revenge, but the presence of a father, a patriarch, a builder whose silence had thundered louder than any outcry could have. His choice, his steady hand pressing ink into paper, became a moment carved into the family's history, one they could never erase no matter how hard they tried. It was not inheritance that lingered, it was the lesson. The children who once laughed too freely grew older, and when their own hair turned gray, they told their children about that night. They did not tell it as a story of loss, though some had lost much. They told it as a story of awakening, of a man they had underestimated, of a truth that revealed itself only when it could no longer be ignored. They remembered not the money or the properties, but the way he had sat taller than them all, the way his silence carried more weight than their words, the way one signature spoke for an entire lifetime. The grandchildren, who had bowed their heads in shame at the table, grew into adults who finally understood. They saw his name not only on legal documents, but etched into scholarships, engraved on plaques at schools, whispered with gratitude in the mouths of strangers whose lives had been changed by his unseen generosity. They realized then what they had not seen before, that their grandfather's greatness had never been measured in wealth he could hand to them, but in the legacy he had chosen to leave behind. A legacy that reached beyond blood, beyond selfishness, beyond the smallness of inheritance. His name lived on in places they had never visited, on buildings they had not built, in opportunities they had not earned. It lived on in the gratitude of children who could now learn because of him, in the hope of families who found shelter through his gifts, in the dignity of causes he had lifted with his final act of truth. They could not escape his legacy because it was larger than their betrayal, larger than their shame. And though he was gone in body, he remained present everywhere his signature had touched. When they gathered years later, telling stories at other tables, no one dared call him weak or fading or irrelevant. No one called him the old man anymore. He was the foundation, the stone they had stumbled over, but which had proved itself unbreakable. His silence had not been weakness. It had been strength greater than fury, patience sharper than any weapon. The final document had not been about dividing wealth. It had been about stitching his name into memory, dignity, justice. It was a declaration that he had lived, that his worth had been undeniable, and that his life could not and would not be erased. And so his name endured, not in fury, not in vengeance, but in legacy. Unerasable, unforgettable, signed once, forever.